Hello and welcome to this plenary sponsored by AOTA. It is my pleasure to be here. I am Kristie Patten Koenig. I'm Chair and Associate Professor in the Department of Occupational Therapy at New York University. I am really excited for you to meet the panel and listen to them. I want to give you a little bit of background as to how this panel came about and then share a couple intro slides before we get on to meeting the panel and spending the next hour and a half listening to autistic individuals. I want to thank the American Occupational Therapy Association for having all of us here and sponsoring this plenary session and live streaming it and recording it, because we really all feel that the messages that you'll hear today really are some messages that need to be heard by our profession. A little background. This plenary came about as a result of a situation that happened when my colleague, Stephen Shore, who is on this panel, submitted a session for this conference, and we, like many of us, it got rejected, and we are all used to that. But the rejection came about because of the language he chose to use, and we're going to be talking about language later. But he used autistic individual, and the reviewers soundly rejected it because he was not using person first language. Stephen, as an autistic individual, like many autistic individuals, chose to use identity first language. And the fact that our profession and the reviewers were really unaware of that speaks to the necessary and need of this panel, and really learning from autistic individuals. This plenary is called Autistic Individuals as Equal Partners, and we can't have an equal partnership if our profession responds like that without an understanding of identity first language. We can't have an equal partnership if our profession doesn't listen to actually autistic individuals. So with that being said, I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping first. We are going to have an autism-friendly plenary on autism, so you can see the pictures with Julia Bascom, who I had the privilege, along with Becca Laurie here on the panel, to be at the UN when the UN did a whole day focused on empowering women and girls that are autistic. And Julia led everyone in what is known as flat pause versus clapping. So I'm going to ask you, for those with sound sensitivities and for those on the panel, that we flap instead of clap as we move through this presentation. I want to talk a little bit about the movement that is going on with the autistic self-advocacy community leading the way, quite frankly, and professionals, in my opinion, being slow to get on board, but we're hoping to change that. So, for example, many of you know the Light It Up Blue campaign by Autism Speaks, and one of the things that autistic self-advocates and that support the neurodiversity movement say, we have enough awareness, and the Light It Up Blue doesn't necessarily help us. We need to move to autism acceptance. And this is Edinburgh Castle in Scotland, and the autistic self-advocates successfully lobbied the castle to use the color of neurodiversity, which is purple. So instead of blue this year, it became purple. In addition, research journals such as this one, Autism, which is one of the top research journals in the field, has gotten rid of the puzzle piece. Autistic self-advocates have led the way in saying we are not a puzzle piece that needs to be figured out. And a leading research journal listened, wrote a very strong editorial as to why they were moving away from the puzzle piece, and now have a much more respectful design. IMFAR, which is the International Meeting for Autism Researchers, in 2017, had a partnership of various groups that opened up a session for actually autistic individuals to let researchers know what they think they should be focusing on. And I'm going to share with you a couple of the responses that were shared on Twitter, and I'll put them up and you can just read them. But the themes that you'll see is to really step away from a deficit model, stop pathologizing, focus on evaluating the environment versus evaluating us, which I think for OTs, that is in our wheelhouse. So how do we make that shift to really support what autistic individuals are saying? We have a lot of information on environmental analysis. And really looking at how can we shift the perspective and include autistic individuals in every phase of our research design, implementation, analysis, and dissemination. And I think that when you see and start listening to autistic individuals like you will have the chance to today, you're going to walk away, I think, profoundly viewing this from a very different lens. With that being said, I would like to go ahead and get started and introduce our panel.
Hey, my name is Paul. I'm a 29-year-old college student and advocate with autism. Everyone with autism tends to be unique, and you will notice I type my words instead of speaking out loud. I do not need to speak. I communicate through typing as clearly as you would verbally. This can be hard to watch and believe, however, lots of people with autism could too, if sincere people take the time and perspective, really in earnest, ameliorating the sensory and motor planning difficulties, so these lost, heartfelt people have a chance to be heard. I had my communication breakthrough at 14, when I learned to type independently. My breakthrough in communication came with Soma Mukhopadhyay's rapid prompting method. RPM is a way to learn to communicate. You are hearing academic material, and asked to keep on answering questions, by quickly pointing to the answers. You then move to spelling out answers using a letter board. For me, this led to typing. Learning to type has allowed me to communicate, share ideas, go to college, and teach people about autism. Before I developed my typing skills, I could listen, but not express myself in a complex way. That is why, even though typing is exhausting and makes me anxious, I do not take it for granted. Without writing, my life wouldn't be as exciting, and would be much more limited. Writing is a powerful tool for anyone who wants to express themselves. Through typing, my life was changed altogether. Before RPM I did not have my own voice. When I started to type, I had a voice. I could tell people what I knew. I was no longer a silent bystander. When I could not talk, I listened and learned, and when I started to type, I was able to tell everyone what I knew. I am majoring in psychology, and have been challenging myself by taking classes on campus. The main point is to have my degree to access employment, a better life, and to increase my understanding of how better to help have a lasting impact, like being a mentor for low-verbal people. I can learn the background of individuals, and figure out how to advocate for them, and teach them to advocate for themselves. Freeing the least verbal people with autism matters. I have what it takes, understanding how just being acknowledged as a person, like everyone else, empowers. If people don't presume intellect, for those that communicate differently, we start off much lower in their esteem. With autistics, our sensory needs, impulsive behaviors, and social differences feed the misconceptions about our ability to think and feel as others do. Always acknowledge a person's intelligence, and they will be more receptive. Often, we can be perceived as being unintelligent, and it can diminish the relationship. Things can be difficult for me, and so I'm ready to sympathize with the struggles of others. I believe others can benefit from my experiences. I want to tell others what I needed to hear as I was learning. You have the potential to live a normal life, that you can become independent, and achieve intellectually. Younger children very much need to hear that they can accomplish more than some people believe is possible. Specifically, it is very helpful to measure progress, making note of not only needs, but also talking about strengths, and how these strengths overcome areas of need. Allow for success often, and interpret success as the result of a person's strengths.
Thank you, Paul. And Melinda Kotler is Paul's mother and his communication assistant this morning. Stephen, want to give your introduction?
Oh, sure. Well, after 18 months of typical development, I was struck with what I call the regressive autism bomb, like what happens to about 30% of us on the spectrum. I lost functional communication, had meltdowns, and became a pretty, what would be considered, severely affected autistic child. In those days, there was so little known about autism, it took my parents a whole year to find a place for diagnosis. And when they did, the doctor said they'd never seen a child who was so sick, but fortunately, my parents, like we see so many parents today, they refuted those professional recommendations for institutionalization. And they convinced the school to take me in about a year. So it was during that year that my parents implemented what we would today refer to as an intensive home-based early intervention program. And this was a program that emphasized music, movement, sensory integration, narration, and imitation. And that's just today's terminology. In those days, the concept of early intervention didn't even exist. Jean Ayres was just beginning to get her ideas together about occupational therapy. And it was really just parents doing what they could to connect with their child. And what did they do? Well, first they tried to get me to imitate them, which didn't work. So then they flipped it around and they imitated me. And once they did that, I became aware of them in my environment. And then they were able to move me along. And I think the key implication is that before you do any good work with an autistic individual, you have to develop that trusting relationship. Then you can move on. And that's what I find the most successful people who can connect with autistic individuals, is that they develop the trusting relationship with them, get into our world, be with us, and that's a really key word, the word with. And what I see is a historical period of time where we're transitioning from doing things to autistic individuals. We have to do things to those behaviors. We have to make changes so that autistic people are more like everybody else. But rather, we're now turning towards the idea of working with autistic individuals. So for example, at age 4, my parents found me taking apart watches with a sharp knife. And rather than saying, well, that's kind of a weird thing to do, we need to work on communication or something of that nature, they soon provided all kinds of other devices to take apart and put back together again. And that's an example of working with the characteristics. Another aspect of autism is that we have an extremely widely varying skill set. So the things we're good at, we're incredibly good at. But also the things that are challenging can be incredibly challenging. And often there isn't that much in the middle, so that's the deal with the extremes, which makes it even more critical that we identify the abilities. We ask the question, what can the autistic person do? And then take it from there. Now certainly there are significant challenges to being autistic. If there weren't, we wouldn't be here trying to figure it out, so we do have to address and remediate for those challenges. However, I've yet to see anybody make a career out of remediated weaknesses. But rather, we need to be looking to our strengths. And that's what my parents did with me. They asked the question, what can I do? Focused on that, and in that way got me through preschool, grade school. I was an academic catastrophe when entering regular school kindergarten. You know what happens to people who are different. Fortunately, school systems are beginning to realize that bullying is not a developmental phase that people need to go through, but rather something needs to be done about it. Academically, I spent most of my time reading books on my favorite subjects. Teachers didn't quite know how to reach me, but since I wasn't a challenge in terms of behavior, I think they just kind of left me to my own devices in the back of the room, reading my books on favorite subjects such as astronomy, weather, earthquakes, and so on. And probably for better rather than for worse, just kind of leaving me to my own devices. These days we know so much more about supporting people who have differences, autistic individuals and otherwise. Middle and high school, things were better. Music being a special interest, focused interest, I joined the band. Now I have that structured activity. in which to mediate my interactions with others. I got so into music that I would spend hours in the instrument closet. I got it into my autistic head that I needed to learn how to play all the instruments. Didn't learn them all, but I did get it up to about 15. And then onward to college. I mean, what could be better than studying music education where you have to learn all the instruments? So all through that, eventually finishing a doctoral degree in special education at Boston University, focusing on autism. And now I divide my time between teaching and researching on issues related to being autistic, successful transition to adulthood, traveling around the world, getting my proprioception and vestibular input by flying in airplanes. So for example, I came here directly from a conference in India. It was great. 52 hours on airplanes for 53 hours in India. But airplanes are really just big sensory integration machines. And also writing books and articles and whatnot about autism. And then finally giving music lessons to autistic individuals during the rare times that I'm home. And that's what brings me here to talk to you, to see what we can do to make fulfilling and productive lives for autistic individuals the rule rather than the exception. So thank you for all you do.
Becca?
Hi, my name is Becca Laurie. I'm an advocate. I am also a certified autism specialist. I'm also the director of communications at the Center of Neurodiversity. I also sit on quite a few boards, and on top of that, I also happen to be autistic. However, I didn't know that about myself until about 6 years ago. 6 years ago, I was finishing up 3 years of laying in bed as suicidal as possible. I should not have been laying there for 3 years. It's my opinion I should have been in a hospital, but that wasn't the case. I was severely depressed after losing my 15th job in 13 years, and I figured I didn't know how to get through any of it anymore. I didn't get it. I was trying my hardest, doing 110%, and that wasn't good enough for the world. So I figured I wasn't meant to be here, and I just locked myself in my room. Fairly certain that the only reason that I'm still here is because of my mom. I couldn't think about going through it and imagining her finding me, so that was the thing that kept me alive. And then I was sort of having migraines, which I'd had my whole life, and they started to change. I was having a smell come along with them, and I didn't recognize it. So I started journaling, as all of my neurologists had ever taught me, about my smell and when I smelled it, what time of year, what was going on outside, what did I eat, all of this stuff. But nobody else could smell this smell. So no matter how many times I would bring my mom to the exact spot in the house that I thought I found the smell, she couldn't smell it. So I started to get really freaked out. Because I read enough to know that it could be a brain tumor, it could be this, it was probably a hallucination, who knew? So I went to the one place that we all go to find information, the internet. And I started on WebMD, and I started looking for something to do with migraines and olfactory stuff, and I just started kind of Googling through, and it was like really serious stuff, and I couldn't really get the information fast enough, so I went to the better source of Wikipedia. And on Wikipedia, I started reading up about hallucinations and olfactory tumors and schizophrenia and all of these other things. And then I was in that vortex that happens when you're in Wikipedia, the little blue button at the bottom that you just keep clicking. So I was clicking through and trying to find what was going on for me. And all of a sudden, I was reading something called sensory processing disorder. And as I was reading it, it was extremely familiar to me. I mean, like not just familiar, like goosebumpy familiar. And I was like, that's really strange. I've kind of always been this way. I never realized it, but yes, I always have my sunglasses on. The lights have always been terrible. I hate the daytime and the summer. And I started to think about all of those components, and I thought, well, that's a really interesting thing. Let me put that aside. I might want to come back to that. And then at the bottom of that article, there was a little blue button that said Asperger's syndrome. And I said, all right, I've never heard of this thing. So click, and I start reading. I can only describe that experience to you as the moment that you're on a roller coaster and you're at the top of that cliff and you're about to drop down and lose all of your gravity and everything kind of just floats for a minute. That's how I was. I was stuck floating while I read that article because it read like my biography. And there was this, I'm going, who lived my life? Who else saw this? Where did it come from? What is this thing? I've never heard of it. And so at the end I was finished and I thought, well, this is really big. and scary. So not knowing what else to do, I took the link and I emailed it to my mom, the one person who I knew I could trust and who knew me better than anybody. And I didn't want a biased opinion because I'm a science person, so I didn't tell her. And I just sent it. I waited the requisite mom days of 3 days before she read her email. Then she read it and came into my room and said, "Where do you want to go to take care of it? You finally found it." And if that's not validating to somebody on the spectrum, I don't know what is. That the one person who's known you since the moment you took your first breath says, "This is what it is. We've been dealing with this your whole life." So at that moment, I kind of got myself together, did some research, because I'm good at that, and found where I could go ahead and get some resources and go ahead and get an evaluation, because I wanted to do it properly. So 6 weeks later, I sat in a room and I got my evaluation, and surprise, surprise, I have autism. And I can tell you now that the girl that was sitting in the chair that received that diagnosis is not the person that's sitting in front of you right now. I was basically incapable of taking care of myself. I was depressed and could not do daily functioning tasks. I had enough anxiety that if I wasn't doing anything about my anxiety, taking medication for it, something like that, I was constantly feeling that way. So I was a pretty sad, broken, lost person in there. And anything that I knew about myself, I didn't trust. That's the person that got diagnosed. 6 years later, I am all of the things that I started my introduction with you to. The last job I had before that was a bartender. So that's what a diagnosis can do for a person. That's what a diagnosis can do for someone at 36. Imagine what it can do for someone who owns that diagnosis from the time that they were 4. That their parents proudly use that word, that they understand how their brain works, that they can learn to accommodate the world for themselves, that they learn to empower themselves, that they learn to be resilient all the way back then. What I wouldn't give to have that time back, but I don't. So I'm using the time I have now to share it with you.
Thank you. I think for those sitting in the room and those that are watching, I think you've just realized after listening to our 3 self-advocates that are going to be teaching you this morning, you're very lucky to be hearing their opinions. Let's start with language before we talk about research and research priorities, because we do think that it's important as a panel to address language. So we've talked a little bit about, and I've shared a little bit about this idea of identity first or person first language. I'm just going to ask the panelists, each of the panelists, what they think about identity first or person first language. So Paul, what are your thoughts?
I prefer identity first language. I agree that really each individual should be asked. I have used both.
Great, thanks. Becca, how about you?
My preference is first person, is to say that I am autistic. I always say identity first. That's my choice. It's been that way since I got diagnosed because it is the word that saved my life. And so I hold that label very proudly, and I use it all over the place. I personally believe it's up to the individual. I think we can learn a lot in the autism community from the LGBT community. The first thing they did was take back their words, so I'm taking back autism, and nobody can use it as a nasty word anymore. So I use it freely, I use it proudly, it's my word. And so I think as autistics, we get to decide what we want to be called. If somebody else prefers to use the term, and I can understand why someone not on the spectrum would want to use the other version, but I think it's really up to the person's choice. Yeah.
Great. Stephen?
Yeah, I agree with both Paul and Becca. Thinking about, I prefer identity first as well. I remember convening a meeting of about 100 autistic individuals at an Autism Society conference, and we asked that very question. There was much discussion about it, people on both sides. Discussion for identity first is autism is part of who we are. It colors everything we do. It doesn't mean that's all we are, but it colors what we do. It's not something that you can put in a bag, for example, and leave it at the door, and then hopefully you don't forget to pick it up on the way out. Again, it's part of us. We're taking back the word. We don't talk about people with Americanism, for example. So why do we need to do the same about autism? And then there was arguments for person-first language, for all the reasons that we use person-first language. Finally, we voted, and it was 80% in favor of identity first. And but finally it was, this is what we prefer, but as Becca just mentioned, use what you want. Don't be insulted if somebody uses the other one. And also, as an adjunct to that, is the idea of how we talk about autistic individuals. The use of the terms high and low functioning. And I think using those terms is a very low functioning way of talking about autism.
Yes, it is.
And really what we should be doing is just be focusing on, what are the supports that are needed? And what are the abilities? Getting back to the abilities-based model, asking the question, what can we do? As opposed to focusing on what can't be done.
Great, thanks. Paul, you had some thoughts on high and low functioning, and I just want to say that we use those words. I've seen them in OT reports. I've seen OTs talk about low and high functioning. And the purpose of this plenary, and now you know the title. Our title was Autistic Individuals, and it was up, and I saw someone looking at the title of our presentation. They're like, that's not person first. So hopefully, I didn't correct him at the moment. I just was like, I hope they watch this. But Paul, you have some thoughts on low versus high functioning. Would you like to share them with us?
Low functioning is a common fallacy. It makes people reduced to failures. It allows people to assess and really dismiss people without any true understanding, including the insights the person has, and the obstacles that prevent the person from being able to participate. Dyspraxia is something I am personally really concerned about for many considered low functioning. Many people are unfamiliar with this, and it makes people seem incapable or defiant. It interferes with work, school, and belonging in groups. Can't we figure a way to make these challenges surmountable?
Great. Becca, your thoughts, low, high functioning.
Yeah, I just have one thought that I think is relevant about the other question that we talked about, because it's happening again, this label thing. It's happening right now, as in like yesterday. So there was a big article that came out about Hans Asperger's and the Nazis and his participation, and people are now questioning about whether or not we can even use the word Asperger syndrome anymore. And there are a lot of people in our community that identify very heavily with calling themselves Aspies. And it is, again, not a negative term in our world, and so that's a new debate on labeling that's even coming out, and language choices, so just be aware. In terms of high and low functioning, I hate these terms. I hate them. It doesn't help me at all for someone to say the words to me, oh, you must be so high functioning. That's what people say to me. And that doesn't help me, because in the times that I'm struggling and when I'm having challenges, I do not feel high functioning, trust me. And so it gets very frustrating. That's the other side of it, when you're on the high functioning side of it, the stuff that you get. And in fact, the very last person to say that to me was my GP. And I just fired my doctor. So that's the kind of stuff that we're dealing with. I don't think it's accurate. In fact, the closest thing to accurate I've heard was most recently at the UN. Dina Gassner said, she called them internalized challenges and externalized challenges. So what we like to call low functioning are the challenges that you can physically see. So people on the outside can see their challenges. Whereas the internalized challenges, which is what we usually end up calling high functioning, because you can't see the challenges, they're the internalized challenges. And I happen to like that labeling a little bit better. It's not as snippy and fast and all that the cute language that people like, but it's much more accurate in terms of explaining the experience.
And before we move on from language, how about nonverbal? The idea of nonverbal versus non-speaking, or any other thoughts on language. Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
I personally prefer making a name that reflects a mode of communication, like typer for me.
Awesome, awesome. Stephen?
Yeah, and likewise, I like to, if we need to divide people into two groups, there are those who divide people into two groups and those who don't. But if we need to, then I think non-speaking is much better than non-verbal, because there's a lot more interaction going on when I'm talking that's part of verbal interaction. And I know many, many non-speaking autistic individuals who I've texted with for hours, and the only reason I know that they don't speak is perhaps I met them at a conference or somebody told me that, but otherwise we're just communicating just as well as anybody else. So therefore, for someone to be nonverbal is a really serious situation where it suggests that we haven't developed a reliable means of communication with them yet. that would be nonverbal. But for someone who doesn't speak, well, we just find another way to communicate, as we see Paul doing over here right now.
My take on it is to use neither. I don't think that either description really helps you to know what you're dealing with in terms of communication or challenges or anything like that. So I actually prefer saying that they use a device to communicate, period. I think that helps you to understand, oh, well, what device? How do I now need to accommodate that? And I think Kristie did a great job. In fact, when she actually introduced me to the panel and wanted to talk about it, the way she told me about Paul is that he uses a device to communicate, so he'll have to pre-record his questions and his answers. And I was like, okay, well, all I said was, all right, I can accommodate for that in my doings, and that's it. It had nothing to do with his capabilities, it had nothing to do with his challenges, it had nothing to do with it. Just he uses a device to communicate, period. Well, guess what? I do too, all the time. So
that's just an example of looking at what we can do using an abilities-based model, focusing on how we do communicate as opposed to being so concerned about perhaps how we don't communicate.
So we as a panel had also decided to, and I believe Paul is typing an answer. So if we can pull up his iPad.
Yes, there are some people who can speak, so they value each word they can say.
And I love that we have a British accent.
Yes, that is lovely.
It is. Get to change the voice. Thank you, Paul. And also, we decided as a panel to think about the division that exists right now, because we want to handle these divisions, because we really feel there should be not only unity between self-advocates and professionals, but there's some division with the self-advocates and parents of individuals that have higher support needs. You don't speak for us, it's not, you don't understand, our children have so many more challenges. And there is that real debate, discussion, angst right now. And so we decided to add that as a question before we move on. And Paul, as someone who uses a device to communicate, I wonder what your feelings are on this topic about individuals that have higher support needs or cannot communicate, where it isn't felt that the autistic community that is verbal speaks for them.
I learned a lot about being more similar in nature to those with Asperger's at Usson. I used to think that individuals with Asperger's led an easier life, because you can easily carry on conversations and are so articulate. I learned that this wasn't necessarily the case, and that anxiety and sensory were huge. The students there suffered a different discrimination. They were thought to be fakers, really not actually having needs. Most non-speaking autistics are assumed to be cognitively impaired. The drive to help every person who needs it find a form of communication will help. Freeing the least verbal people with autism matters. I have what it takes, understanding how just being acknowledged as a person like everyone else empowers.
Great. Becca, thoughts on this division?
This division drives me crazy. It is the reason that I have barely participated in Autism April this year. I can't stand that we are constantly being divided within our community. Not only is it pointed out how divided we are regularly, all the time in our social media and our conversations, we're asked questions like this repeatedly, low functioning, high functioning, right? We have to talk about it all the time. And that continues that division. When you see autistics together, if you ever find yourself at an autism conference and you see a bunch of autistics together functioning, we don't say, oh, the nonverbals are over there. That doesn't happen. We're all autistic. And in fact, when our label got changed on us and we all went under the ASD umbrella, that was the best thing that ever happened to our community. It gave us numbers. It let us unite ourselves. And the backlash from that and the anger from that really didn't help us get forward very much. But once we passed by that, we started to move forward as a community. And what I'd like to see is that forward motion. There's absolutely things that that adults on the spectrum can teach the parents of children on the spectrum if they would just stop and listen. There's a difference between what a child can articulate about their experience and what an adult can articulate about their experience. I can go back and articulate for you what my struggles were in elementary school now as an adult with the language of autism that I have. I couldn't have back then. So you could have asked me my opinion back then, but my answer to everything then was no. So it doesn't matter. And I think if you are really looking towards having your child succeed and get the best that they can out in the world, it would behoove you to listen to the adults on the spectrum, because many of the adults that are speaking now have been diagnosed late in life. And so many of us floated around in the world facing our challenges with absolutely no supports. I have never had an OT. I can't tell you how big the burn on my finger is right now because I can't use the kitchen properly. I have really horrible fine motor coordination. My handwriting is illegible. And I would love to be able to go see an OT. There are no OTs for adults. And so that's sort of, those are, you know, and so when those kids grow up and they become adults, there's still not going to be OTs for adults. And so my hope in being an advocate is that by speaking about my experience, that huge number of kids that we have that were diagnosed in the 90s and, you know, the aughts and whatnot, that when they come to be my age, there are systems in place for how they can function, that they don't have to fight the battles that we're fighting now. And I think if the parents want that for their kids, they need to stop yelling over us and start listening to us.
Okay, I'd like us to shift to talk about autistic research, partnerships and priorities. And I'm going to read something in a recent article by Dr. Liz Pellicano entitled, "Autism Advocacy and Research Misses the Mark If Autistic People Are Left Out." She outlined the fact that research priorities have ordinarily been set almost exclusively by scientific funders and academics. And so, autistic people have rarely been involved in the decision-making process that shaped research or its application. They have been excluded from the very research that directly concerns them. This is changing as an increasing number of researchers have been working with autistic people as partners, and you'll hear some examples of that today. Autistic people are included in all stages of the research project to address issues that are prioritized by them. She gives an example, and as an example, she highlights the participatory autism research #KnowYourNormal project, which if we can put up on the screen so they can get the hashtag. Together with 3 young autistic adults, they set out to understand autistic mental health, which was a priority identified in the UK as the #1 research priority among autistic stakeholders is mental health. And in obtaining the views of over 100 young autistic adults aged 16 to 25, they found a very different picture by including autistic young adults in every phase of the research. Researchers typically look at anxiety, for example, and compare autistic populations to neurotypical populations, looking for atypical signs of anxiety linked to autism. This focus presumes that the causes of anxiety lie within the individual person themselves, or with the specific autistic features, rather than in the way in which non-autistic people interact with them. That's us, guys. Their findings, and I quote, "Our participants, to the contrary, identified one key source of their anxiety was rooted in the behavior of others. Others' perception, others' often hostile actions towards them, which resulted in them being excluded, frowned upon, and made to feel unnatural." If they're right, then it's precisely these experiences from which we, as non-autistic researchers, need to be learning if we want to understand the nature of anxiety and autism. And you can see how that would be 2 very different intervention models. The anxiety residing within the person with autism, or the anxiety because of all of us and how we react. That's one great example, I think, of what can happen when the script is flipped and you really include autistic individuals at every phase of the research. So that's just one example of how authentic participation can change research, its focus and its design and subsequent results. What are your thoughts about authentic participation and partnerships, and who does the current research agenda in autism benefit? Paul?
Makes sense that having autistic individuals involved as true collaborators is the only way to get meaningful results that can improve lives. We autistics need a more collective approach and better collaboration, making it possible to be, indeed, more average people, making a full life including all areas within the scope of occupational therapy. Making the transition to being in an apartment will encompass many areas, like taking care of myself and the apartment, safety, community, navigating the town, anxiety and sensory in a new place. I think research should take a holistic approach, looking at all the needs of the individuals in the context of where they live, work and have social and leisure activities. Figure out the best ways an individual learns and include accommodations, like technology, and means for a full life. The knowledge gained can be shared. I would volunteer for this research. This would allow those seen as dependent to make self-determined lives. Teams of occupational therapists with a variety of expertise at universities across the country could participate. Having this team approach would lead to many more autistics being able to do more for themselves. This would lead to fewer supports needed. Autistics who are non-speakers, and usually dyspraxic, are seen as incapable. This is to change.
Stephen?
Yes, and another example of this work occurring is a project that I'm involved with, Teal Benavides, who is also an OT and at this conference. I'll be co-presenting with her a little bit later today. And we applied to PCORI, Patient Care Outcome Research Institute, and won a $250,000 award to study what are the most challenging medical issues facing autistic individuals. Well, Teal and I certainly had our own ideas about what they might be and how we might address them, but to increase the validity of our research, we felt we needed to go to the autistic community. So we developed we assembled a community council composed of mostly autistic individuals, of which Becca is part of that council, and we asked them, so what's the biggest challenge facing us? And the same thing bubbled up, mental health. And that's very interesting, considering that autistic individuals are considered not to understand, you might say, matters of the mind. And that's just another example of going to the autistic community, asking us, what are the challenges? And this research is also an example of authentic and complete autistic involvement at every stage of the research, from writing up the proposal to design, implementation, analyzing the data, and eventually getting to the dissemination of what we found. And we've also arrived at some very interesting findings, and as a result have put together an engagement guide. Now, how do we best interact with autistic individuals? How do we best engage in terms of research? And one area that we identified with a lot of help from Becca over here was compensation for our work, for our contributions to research. And just as anybody else would be paid to engage in research, to disseminate research, whatever that involvement is, so should autistic individuals. And this is the first time where there's an actual guide in which we can get that done.
And I know the guide is a work in progress, and I saw a draft of it, and it is amazing. It covers compensation, communication, engagement in an authentic way with researchers, non-autistic researchers working with autistic researchers and autistic individuals, and it'll be a wonderful resource for us. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Becca?
I'm really proud of the work that we're doing with ASSET. I'm very excited about it. It was the beginning of what I perceive to be some really good forward motion on this topic. I think up until now, the truth is that autistic researchers have always been there. They just haven't been labeled autistic researchers. If you want to find autistics, we all hide in universities and academia because we get to talk about our special interests for a living. So we're all there already. It's just that we're not allowed to be open about it and still be taken seriously. And that's really the root of the problem, is that for some reason, the autistic experience, the autistic opinion, the autistic choice just doesn't seem to be validated. by everybody else as an option. And that's kind of scary. So all of your choices and all of the things that you want to be doing just aren't okay, is basically what we're told, and that they're not valid. And so that doesn't really sit well when you're thinking, well, all I want is supports, and in order to get them, I need to participate in research, because without the research, we don't get the funding, and I can't have my supports. So if I really want those things, I need to participate in research. But when I go and I do that, I'm really not treated with any kind of accommodations for my autism. In fact, the very people that are looking to get my data aren't treating me kindly about my sensory, about my autism, about the money that I may be losing to come in and participate in their study, about the transportation struggles I might have to get to their study. And they don't think about all of those pieces. They just want my data. Well, here's the deal. Autistics now control our data. It is up to us whether we give it to you. And you guys are going to have to do better if you want our information. So that's really what it comes down to now.
I'm just going to clap on that. We have to do better. We want to collaborate truly and authentically. You wrote an article for The Love of Science that I just read, and I would refer the audience out there to read. Which is another great research thing we have going on in our community. Autism in Adulthood. It's a brand new academic journal. Christina Nicolaitis over in Portland, she and Dora Raymaker, who is an autistic researcher, they partnered together and partner in research, and they brought together an academic journal. They got it published, and so our preview issue is out now. It is a neurodiverse group of people writing about autism, and that includes autistic researchers and autistics. And I'm proud to be included in the preview issue, be it a little divisive, but I am in there. So yeah, and so check that out as well in terms of forward motion, yeah. And it's just a wonderful model of this authentic collaboration and authentic partnership by a non-autistic researcher, autistic researcher. They've been doing it for so long. Yep. I know Christina's been doing it for so long, and really her work is both Dora and Christina's work is leading in this space. And there are many other examples. Stephen, do you want to talk about PARC and our experience with PARC?
Yes, Participatory Autism Research Collective. And this is a group of autistic and non-autistic people who understand the need, the requirement for authentic autistic involvement in research. So Kristie and I co-taught a course focused on strength-based approaches for supporting autistic individuals in a study abroad program for NYU in London. We spent some time with PARC. Damien Milton is the director of that organization. And one thing that is very exciting is that we're talking about setting up a satellite PARC here in the United States. And I think we're ready for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about specific areas of OT and the focus of what our focus is and how that intersects with the research that we're doing as a profession, the potential collaboration and partnerships that we could look at. We talked about OT's work in these different areas of occupation, activities of daily living, instrumental activities of daily living, leisure, education, work, play, social participation, sleep, I know, is a big issue in the autistic community. And many OTs also do research and implement programs to address the sensory motor issues. Are there specific areas you think OT should focus on in those domains? And Paul, I know you wanted to describe your sensory and motor challenges and strengths from your perspective that researchers should be thinking about as well. So we're going to let you go first on this one.
I am always seeking sensory input, new smells, the way light shines off an object, or the perfectly balanced song. Imagine your own senses being turned up past the maximum setting. Light, sounds, smells, textures can all be captivating, overwhelming, or unbearable. Smells can be overwhelming but also irresistible. Optimal conditions vary day to day. Some days scent and sound fluctuations are not as bothering. Some days they are very intense. I don't want to drown out all sensory experiences. There are some that are quite enjoyable on certain days, but can be a real hindrance to communication on others. It seems like Greenwich Village, in New York City, would be an overwhelming sensory experience, but lands me in a sensory calm place. Greenwich Village is very exciting. So much traffic and many vehicles to look at. It makes me less anxious, because I can focus my mind on something that really interests me. Sometimes I even forget about other things that are hard with sensory issues. I really like it, because there is so much automation. Mechanics everywhere, moving and seeing and hearing that. Different cars can be picked out by the way their engines run. I can know what car will be coming before I see it, and then I see it, and it is fun to know I picked it out and was right. Cabs sound different than trucks. Sometimes I can even hear a bike coming. Lots of mechanical noises to keep me focused. I don't care about the crowds because of it. There are so many people around, too. I couldn't find that I get lost in the crowd and no one notices that I move differently or act differently because there are so many around. The noise is so much that I cannot pick out individuals, so it is much less likely to take away my attention by listening, and that is relaxing.
And I love your descriptions, because I think as a researcher, if you're a researcher looking at sensory issues, the descriptions you provide are so thick with the nuances of everyday life and as it relates to sensory function versus, oh, this is an issue. And I think by authentically listening, you'll get a very different research agenda and a way to focus on. You know, Paul, you did talk about kind of the chaos. What helps in a chaotic sensory environment?
Feeling calm is so critical. I am fortunate to have excellent occupational therapists who set up a morning workout I do every day. I run and walk on the treadmill and ride an exercise bike. Then I do sit-ups, push-ups and planks. I feel calmer with exercise. I can slowly be in more control and a better frame of mind if I am regulated. I love and need exercise. It helps give me more control over my body and reduces my anxiety. Having my mind engaged reduces my anxiety and impulsivity, too. Intrinsic motivation is strongest of all.
Okay, and then finally, you had some thoughts on motor planning, which a lot of OTs focus on as well.
My brain doesn't communicate with my body perfectly, and to learn a new movement, I need to practice over and over. It takes much training and repetition. However, I have more and more ability and more flexibility to make new motor plans because of all the work I've done in the past. Sometimes the more ingrained motor plan takes over when I intend to do something else, like I might unintentionally close the door on someone behind me. Being able to search the refrigerator for something while still remembering the item can be hard, because I am trying to think and move at the same time. Riding a bike really makes me nervous because I have to lift my legs off the ground and pick up speed, which distorts things visually. However, I am a great ice skater. I feel carefree on skates. I began practicing rollerblading when I was young. I could very easily balance once I learned and, interestingly, easily move around obstacles. I transitioned easily to ice skating. Having freedom of movement on the ice feels so The advantage to having worked hard at learning seemingly easy skills made me resilient and willing to take on more challenges like college, self-advocacy and advocating for those without a voice to have the opportunity to communicate.
You're doing great. You're doing great. Okay, Stephen, your thoughts?
Yes, everything we perceive is through our senses. So that's why it's so vitally important to be aware of how sensory input, how we perceive sensory input, processing, and then the output, you might say, movement of the body. A big challenge that we face is body to environmental awareness. Where does the body end? Where does the environment begin? And as Paul suggested, movement is really helpful with that, for us to understand where our body is. In the proprioceptive and vestibular areas, I tend to be a sensory seeker, and that's part of the reason that I fly around the world talking about autism, because it means riding in these big sensory integration machines that we happen to call airplanes. Another aspect I feel that's important about sensory issues is to do what you can to help autistic individuals understand what it means to them to have these sensory and motor differences. So, for example, many of you may think that this hat's a fashion statement, and in many ways it is, and it's always good to support your university, but at the same time it's an accommodation, because one thing that being autistic means to me is that recessed lighting fixtures and I don't get along. Being in a room with recessed lighting fixtures, for me, is probably like looking into a spotlight for most other people. So one of the things I do whenever I go into a room is what I call a sensory audit. The lighting, and especially in restaurants, the noise. So how does that play out in a typical situation? Suppose my supervisor, my boss, is showing me a new office, which I'm going to work in, and I realize that it's lit with recessed lighting fixtures. So number one, I need to recognize whatever challenges there are in the environment. I recognize the challenge. And from there, I need to develop an advocacy plan, an effective self-advocacy plan that another person can understand and provide support. So it may just be as simple as, well, you know, I wonder if it's okay if I wear a hat during work. I notice that nobody else is. Oh, maybe that one person over there is wearing a hat. Is it okay if I wear a hat during work? There's the advocacy plan. It's easy to understand. The supervisor can provide support. Actually, I got my own support. Nothing else needs to be done. And that's after that second stage of advocacy is the third. And the third stage is disclosure. If I'm going to ask for an accommodation or greater mutual understanding, then I need to give a reason why. And the reason why is, these lights give me a headache. I must have sensitive eyes. So that's known as a partial disclosure. There was no need to do a little workshop on sensory issues, much as I'd love to give one, like I gave a couple days ago, much as I'd like to talk about being autistic and being proud of the things I'm able to do with the autistic characteristics. Just a simple partial disclosure focusing on the simple aspect of what is affecting the situation. And then finally, if I have enough wherewithal to throw in, you know, I'll be much more productive for your company if I can wear this hat. That will help as well. So another thing to consider.
Becca, how about you? Priorities for us as a profession from your perspective?
Well, I think we have a lot to deal with, and I think we have a lot of room to work with. I think what I'm learning now about myself is that a lot of my regulation issues, which again are internalized most of the time, come from the fact that I have kind of an odd sensory profile. So I have stuff that like when I hear and see and I touch, those things are really sensitive for me, but pain I don't feel. And so that becomes a struggle in terms of motor coordination because I don't necessarily feel where I'm at ever. So I have issues with proprioception as well. And so I'm usually covered in bruises. I have injuries, multitudes all over myself all the time because I just honestly am not aware of where my body ends and begins, which is not something I knew about myself before my autism. I didn't have the words to explain that to anybody. I also always have fidgets with me. I usually, when I talk about sensory stuff, I do my whole sensory thing, which is in my bag, and I have different sensory fidgets. I've actually become a collector now. So I take them and I use them, and sometimes I have favorites and I give them to people because I'm like, this is such a good one. Your hands are fidgety. Here. It's like giving someone a pen, and it's amazing. And sometimes they work for one person and they don't work for other people. So like this is my favorite. I'm a big fan of silent fidgets because I hear things like crazy and they distract me. Other people like the noises that they make. They like the metal. They like that sound. So I say, you guys can teach the adults that it's okay for them to have sensory items. It's okay for us to talk about that as grown-ups we still have sensory needs. And the other thing that concerns me, I think, in terms of looking forward is I worry about our geriatric population a lot. I think our geriatric population is going to need the OT facilities a lot if we focus that way. We are fallers, we are bumpers, and as we all know, the older you get, the harder that is to do to yourself. And I know now I'm getting older, I have high blood pressure, I have all of these other things going on, and those are scary, especially for those of us on the spectrum who already struggle with the medical profession. So, the idea of getting older and falling and, needing a hip replacement is terrifying. And who would I go to as a rehab therapist that would understand my autism and what the role that will play in my rehab? No idea. Don't know what that looks like. So yeah, please, if you're out there in the field and you're looking to do something new, think about adults and geriatrics in the spectrum. We're there, and that huge group, that population that's in the transition programs right now, they're coming. They're money. So think about it.
Great, great. I've collaborated with all of you in many different ways on many different projects, and I've grown so much in my understanding, I can no longer even think to design a research project without autistic stakeholder involvement or from a deficit-based model. Like, let me plan a study to see what's wrong and how this compares to non-autistic individuals. So that study model doesn't really work anymore for me. So what does it mean to shift to a strength-based approach in service provision, in research, and how would it look if a profession did that on a large scale and said, we're done looking at a deficit-based approach, and we want to make this shift that really looks at strengths, doesn't ignore the challenges, like Stephen had said, they're there, but really changes the lens that they look at things with and makes that shift. So, Paul, what do you think if we shifted to a strength-based approach?
For me, shifting an emphasis to strengths saved me in better accepting myself. Very powerful and motivating, having confidence I could accomplish meaningful, heartfelt goals, and I could get supports, instead of focusing on my deficiencies.
Yes, like how can we look at supports and services? I think we see that time and time again. Becca, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the only way to really move forward is to talk in terms of strengths. I think deficits got us to a certain point. We had nothing, so we started with deficits. That's fine. But now we're in a place where we know that the strengths are actually greater than the challenges, and oftentimes the strengths can actually make up for some of the deficits. And so what I say is the strength-based approach is a win all around. When we work with strength-based approaches, the self-esteem grows for the person who's working, because when you move from little success to little success to little success to little success, you have motivation to continue on. We don't have a lot of motivators as autistics. There's not a lot of stuff that gets us into that social mood. So if you can get somebody excited about something, I say get them excited. If I'm continuing to do something and always failing and still having to do it all the time, I'm not going to be a nice person. I'm not going to want to be out in the world. I'm certainly not going to want to work with you. And who wants those clients? Nobody. So I don't get that whole play. Why wouldn't you want to tell someone, you're so great at this thing, let's work with it and figure out how we can use this thing to help you with this thing over here that's not so great. And understanding that all humans have things they're good at and things they're bad at and things they need help with. Nobody lives independently. We all live interdependently and rely on somebody for something. Most of you have an accountant, I'm sure, to do your taxes, and that is relying on somebody else. And so what I say is, yeah, we have strengths. We have them in spades. And if you include us in our own decision-making process, if you include us in our therapies, if you let us be participants in our own supports, you're going to have a greater success rate. Your numbers are going to look better. I have to use these terms because I feel like when I talk this way to everybody, they get it, they hear it, and it comes across. It's dollars in your pocket, it's money in your pocket, it's clients out the wazoo, and it's happy clients. And for us as autistics, that means that we're functional human beings, that we're living a life that we feel is successful, that we feel is fulfilling, because those things are different. How you define those things are different, as you are different as a person. So, yeah.
Great advice. Stephen?
Well, that brings to mind what I call the 3 A's of autism. And that is, we spent the last generation developing awareness of autism, realizing when autism is in our midst, recognizing it, whether you're an OT, parent, educator, doctor, somebody in the community, employee, whoever it is, even autistic people ourselves. Now we've gotten pretty good at recognizing it. And what that does is build a firm foundation on which to move to the next level, which is acceptance. Acceptance of those autistic characteristics. And acceptance doesn't mean well, the person has such sensory issues, they have meltdowns in Walmart, they fail the Walmart test, but we're just going to let them have a meltdown because they're autistic and that's just how it is. That's some sort of weird form of denial. But what it is recognizing those sensory characteristics and working with them. And what can we do to help that person either be able to go into a Walmart maybe for a shorter period of time, or realizing that you can lead a fulfilling and productive life not going into Walmart in the first place. So that's acceptance, and that's also when we transition from doing things to autistic individuals to working with autistic individuals, as Becca was talking about. Let's work with those strengths. Let's identify those strengths, work with them, given the widely varying skill set. Those strengths, as Becca said, come in spades. So let's use them.
Yeah, can I bring
And what that does is get us ready for what I'm seeing glimmers of. The third and the pinnacle is appreciation. And that's when we see autistic individuals valued for who we are, for what we can contribute to society. We're seeing some businesses beginning to do that. Small software companies such as Microsoft and Google and SAP. However, what is also important is to keep in mind that we're not all IT geeks. As a matter of fact, it's only a small portion of us who are. It's a big enough group to write about, get excited about. It looks really cool to see it in print and to perseverate on it. However, my question always is, what about everybody else? What about everybody else who have skills in other areas? And also, what about everybody else who perhaps needs more support in order to be successfully employed? And there is a place for all of us to do something. We all need to work for a living. Successful and meaningful employment gives meaning to life. And that's an important thing to focus on. So by looking at those 3 A's of autism, moving towards the appreciation stage, in addition to autistic individuals benefiting, so does the rest of society.
Great. Let's talk about future areas. Becca, you mentioned the geriatric population, the aging population, and some of the healthcare concerns. And any other thoughts about future directions for OT and research based on our domain of concern?
I do. I'm actually going to have Walter come up now because Walter, to me, is a perfect example of OT in daily life. He has allowed me to have greater freedom in my life. He's my emotional support animal. When I adopted him, he was just a shelter puppy. And I've worked really hard. My fiance and I, Antonio, have worked him really hard. We've trained him all the way through the therapy dog program, so he can take the test if he wants to and pass it. But he's my emotional support animal, and I don't use him in a therapeutic setting, so I've left him as an emotional support animal. I use him a lot. I actually have him with me almost all the time, mostly because he's like super cute, and I can't not have him around. But he's also the perfect example of what happens when you're out in the world and you want to use OT focuses. Thank you. So when I go home from a day, like if I'm here all day and I have Walter, usually he's not with me if I'm out in the world because it's a little rough, but I come home and the first thing that I do is I have him to pet, and he greets me and he lets me know that he's happy I'm home, which all of a sudden makes me feel happy, which is really hard to have happen when you're somebody on the spectrum and you're constantly living in a chaotic environment. He also gives me sensory input like immediately, right? And his ears are really super soft, so they're my favorite. So when I go to sleep at night, the first thing that he does is he waits for me to get into bed, and then he hops up into bed with me and he hooks into my legs. And then he flops down all 65 pounds of himself right onto my legs. And if you want to talk about some really good proprioception, that's some really good proprioception. And it's like a weighted, warm blanket. And then I get to do the sensory input with his ears and pet him. And he just thinks it's the best thing ever. He's also been, I've found some other little hidden things out since I started getting Walter and I started to take this journey with him, which is that he's super social. I'm not. And what that means is that whenever I go out into the world, I am forced with Walter to be social. I have no choice. The minute people see him, they want to pet him. I have to explain what an emotional support animal is. I have to make sure that Walter sits before he gets pet. That's our rule. And that he's doing all of his behaviors because he is working. And so am then forced to engage in real time in social interactions with people I don't know all the time. If I don't want to do that, I literally have to leave Walter home. I cannot have him with me. He also forces me to do exercise. That's the genius thing, right? If I don't exercise him, like before we came here, we were here talking, I had Antonio have him out in the park, because he gets his time off too, and he needs to get his energy out too. Otherwise, he would have whined through this whole thing, and nobody would have enjoyed it. So we respect his neurodiversity and his needs, but he does have exercise needs. And what that means is that I became a hiker. And so we now hike off leash, and we have a second dog, and we all go. And so now we're moving to Colorado to hike with Walter, which is like an amazing, I never imagined that I would do those things in my life. And then along the way, I figured out that the training process for a dog was sort of something that needed to be accommodated for in the autism spectrum. We actually had to train Walter 3 times. He went to the trainer once doing an example. And the trainer did it, and Antonio watched, and I watched, and then Antonio would do it with the trainer. Okay? And I still had to watch, because that's motor planning. There was all kinds of motor planning with the training. How to hold the leash, when to hold the leash, when you can move it, when you can't be, how to hold your body, how much tension is in your arm, what is the volume of your voice? Are you using your dog voice? Are you not using your dog voice? There was just endless things that were going on that I had to be aware of for him, which forced me to be aware of my own. The one thing that I struggled with more than anything was the vocal regulation. I have a really hard time when I'm frustrated regulating my voice. That doesn't work with dogs. You have to have a regular tone no matter what. And I had to learn to find my dog voice. That was really hard for me. And so we struggled with that. So when we came home after with the trainer, then Antonio had to teach me like he was the trainer, and we took Walter through it again, and then I had to go through it another time, and I had to be the trainer, all to accommodate for all of the autism needs that I was having. But we did it, and we got a better trained dog for it, but we did it. And so my hope is that I can eventually inspire other autistics to know that as adults, they don't have to have no supports. They get to have supports, and they get to design their own supports. Because an emotional support animal is just asking to be your animal. They're not needing to be trained for anybody else. They don't have to be good with anybody else. I don't care that he whines. Some people would be driven nuts by it. That doesn't bother me. What would bother me is if he jumped up at me when we came in the house. There are other rules that he's not allowed to do, because he has to be my dog. He has to work for me, and that's it. And so when we're done here, I'm going to bring him down there with Antonio. You guys are more than welcome to come up and pet him. He loves it. But yeah, so think about it. If you're interested in animals, there's work to be done, and I think it's going to really change our population.
Great, great. Any other thoughts on future areas?
Well, getting back on what I mentioned earlier is doing what you can to help autistic individuals understand their own sensory profile. And what that sensory profile means to them as we go about our occupation, as we move about during the day, what kind of accommodations, such as this hat, can we use in order to be more successful. So keeping these things in mind as you go about supporting and developing support plans for autistic individuals would be great.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're going to finish with, and we will have some time for questions, but we're going to finish, AOTA in their vision statement, their Vision 2025, identifies one of our main goals as a profession is to maximize health, well-being, and quality of life. How do you think OT researchers and OT practitioners can achieve that vision in partnership with the autistic community? Paul?
By making acknowledgement of a lasting commitment to those people without a voice. Help them persevere and find their path in reaching for a communication system that lets them connect.
I think that is incredible advice for well-being and quality of life. And you look at your quality of life and how it drastically improved once you were able to access communication, and our role, OT's role, in collaboration with other professionals and autistic stakeholders in really exhausting and valuing and listening to authentic communication. So thank you. Stephen, your thoughts on our vision statement?
Yeah, well, relatedly, when in doubt, ask. Ask us. Ask us what we want. Ask us what we need. And if we're at a point where we're not able to communicate in a reliable fashion, observe. Keenly observe. what our preferences are, where our challenges are, also where are our strengths, and how we can maximize our strengths in order to lead a fulfilling and productive life.
And Becca, when I posed this question, you sent me a fabulous visual of how we can maximize health, well-being, and quality of life. And you sent me this picture that I'll leave up on the screen. What are your thoughts?
This is my new pet project in my own personal life, is this little concept. Because what I was noticing was that autistics were wasting their spoons. Like, we were wasting our energy trying to conform, trying to do all these things, trying to work and have a social life and a personal life and have the energy to do all of those things. And what I was finding was I couldn't do any of those things as separate activities. They were all so interrelated and they all used my energy that nothing ever felt right in a separated sense. So what I needed to do is kind of integrate my life a little more and think about, what do I want to do for a living, but what do I enjoy, and what are the things that, and can I make them all into one thing? Can I be doing for a living what I enjoy? Can I be creating a lifestyle that feels comfortable to my personness? Can I be feeling successful and fulfilled, and all of the things that means? And I found this great concept called Ikigai, which I think is so cool. There's a book out now too. And it explains the whole concept. It's a Japanese concept, and it's basically the idea that you want to combine all of these different little Venn circles to create the most comfort that you can, to feel the most fulfilled and live the best life possible with the time that you're given on this planet. And it works for everybody, autistic or not. It's just a really nice sense of, hey, if we think about all of our needs as human beings and we lay them on top of each other instead of deciding what our career is going to be and going down that path, that we're whole humans all the time when we're doing our work, when we're doing our fun. It doesn't matter. And I think that whole human concept is the piece that's missing in research. The idea that autistics are whole humans, not broken neurotypicals. The idea that we have opinions, that we should be given choices, that we need to be taught how to make decisions just like everybody else. Those pieces are the pieces of the independence that everybody is seeking so much. Nobody teaches us that we have choices and that we're allowed to have an opinion and that we can make our own decisions.
So well said, and I think, I think that as we as OTs listen and learn, and we as a profession listen and learn from autistic self-advocates and authentically partner, this is so in line. When you sent it to me, it just spoke to me so much as this is what OT should be doing, And I think if we look at how we interact with individuals, and you look at our evaluations, and I would encourage you to look at your evaluations. Think about, how big is your section on presenting problems? How big is your section on strengths? We have to listen and flip that. And then we can begin to really, I think, maximize health, well-being, and quality of life. I want to thank the panel. I know Paul has a couple take-home messages, and then I'll ask Stephen and Becca for their kind of take-home message that they want you to leave with. And I think we will have time for a couple questions. There are two mics if you want to come up and ask a question as well. So Paul, your take-home messages.
I think it is important to look at those of us with autism as not disordered, but on a continuum of normal behavior that ranges from what may seem normal to most people to that which is different in ways of interacting with things around us, seeing things differently, hearing and smelling things differently. Treat nonverbal people as totally intact in every way. They need an advocate so they can make the same breakthrough I have. Show patience and understanding without patronizing. Talk to us like peers. Everyone deserves dignity. No matter what a person acts like outside, they may just be unable to share their inner thoughts with you. I'm a living example. The behaviors I demonstrate outwardly have nothing to do with my intellect. In reality, there are full, complex people trapped within, until they find a way to communicate. Overall, I want people to know that I am a normal guy, who just happens to communicate differently than the vast majority of people. A guy who has different ways of dealing with the great amount of sensory input that is found naturally in the environment, and a guy who has lots to say, if people take the time to listen.
I think everyone in this room and listening couldn't agree more with that take-home message. Stephen, your take-home?
Yeah, a couple of ideas come to mind. One is, as Becca mentioned, or maybe it was Kristie, we aren't broken individuals. We aren't poor imitations of typical individuals, but help us become the best autistic people we can be. So rather than thinking of us as being a disordered way of being, autism is a different order of being. And with that comes the great diversity within the autism spectrum, which may even be greater than the general population. And on that, what comes to mind is when you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person.
Becca?
I have two takeaways, I think. First, to take us back to the beginning of the conversation, please stop dividing us. The people of the autism community, the autistics specifically, we don't divide ourselves. So could you please stop forcing the division upon us, is really what I want to say. You don't need to separate us between low functioning and high functioning. We don't care about that, and those labels are for everybody else. It's kind of for everyone else's use, so change the labels. And the idea of being separated into advocates and parents, the idea of being separated into professionals and autistic advocates, and as though somehow the autistics are not professionals, we're not the researchers, we're not the parents, but we are all of those things. We live in all of those groups. And so, stop dividing it. We don't want the division. And so I just don't see the point. It's a waste of energy to me. It creates arguments and places and spaces, and we could be using that energy for moving forward. And then I think I would like to go back to the whole idea of the listen message for researchers, for professionals, for parents even. Listen to us. Julia Bascom said a great thing at the UN. She literally said, I wrote it down, we know what we need, she said. Ask us, listen. We know what we need, because we really do, but nobody's ever bothered to ask. So thank you for the platform to do it in today.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening and authentically listening. And I think hopefully I want to thank my #ActuallyAutistic panel, and hopefully you can be a #actually an ally and know what that means now, and know that it means something profoundly different than you may have thought of before. So thank you. We do have time if anyone does have any questions, a couple of minutes for questions. Just step up to the mic.
Hi guys. So my mom is a teacher, a high school teacher, and she's got some kids in her class that are on the spectrum. So I was just wondering, at that age level, what would be something that you wish your teachers would have given you?
So something that you wish the teachers would have given you when you were in high school, is that?
Okay. Yes.
High school.
High school.
I don't know.
We're processing.
I think by the time I got to high school, I was pretty lost cause. I hate to say that, but I really had been horribly bullied throughout elementary and middle school, not by my peers, but by my teachers. And so by the time I got to high school, authority figures had this really funky, nasty place in my life. And so by then I had sort of turned everybody out. I'm not sure what would have helped me if I was kind of in a better state there. Probably understanding that it's okay to be really smart at one thing, but not so smart at something else. The bullies, my teacher bullies really liked to point out how good I was at English and how lazy I was at math, instead of telling me that I had a learning disability with numbers. So that's kind of, but that we can exist in that platform, yeah.
Yeah, and I think a greater understanding of autistic differences, as Becca said, making sure that teachers aren't blinded by our strengths. Because that's what leads to so many comments. Well, Becca is so good at English, I don't understand why she has such a hard time in mathematics. It's not that hard, and I hear these types of conversations going on. And also, we need to provide more support for teachers as well. Because what I find behind teacher comments or fear of autistic and other individuals who are different is that they aren't quite sure what to do with us. They don't know what to do. Teachers inherently want to teach. So let's give teachers those tools and those supports so they can understand autistic students like us.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello. Stephen said something about the partial disclosure of why you wore your hat. And I really like that you said that because my child has autism. He'll be 10 next month. And one of the things I struggle with is when to fully disclose, when to like partially disclose, and when to not say anything. You know, we'll start, like he started baseball, you know, so the question is, do we go and we tell the coach this is what's going on, and let that negative stereotype happen before he even meets the child? Or do we partially disclose? Do we not disclose? You know, so I struggle with that all the time. So do you have advice as adults with autism to give a mom who's really trying to help her child?
Yes, I do. So the first part is, do we consider disclosing? And with disclosure, the reason why you disclose is because you're advocating in some way, so the two come together. And the way I look at it is that if the effect of being autistic significantly impacts the situation, or there is a need for greater mutual understanding, then it's time to consider an advocacy plan, which is really what you're doing. And then the question is it a full or a partial disclosure? Different situations are going to be different, are going to call for different responses, and it may be as simple as, you know, my son is really interested in joining the team. He'll be a wonderful member of the team, and in order to maximize his success, it's important to make sure that you have the day's agenda or the practices agenda, everything kind of lined out, clearly lined out, perhaps in written form. And in addition to helping him, it will probably help everybody else as well. And in that way, it's more of a partial disclosure. My son does really well when. Now that said, there is more and more being learned about autism. And in the academic community, there is more understanding. And if you do say the word autism, it's less of a mystery. So part of it is also getting a sense of how much the coach might understand about having autism. So these are the things that I consider.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to add to that statement. I feel like I'm the devil on one person's shoulders,
go
and he's
for
the angel on anybody else's shoulders. So here's the part of the whole question that bothered me. What do I do? Does he have to deal with the negative stereotype? Well, here's the problem. Negative stigma, that was the word you used. The problem with that is that there is a negative stigma and that you shouldn't have to be worrying about that. So the issue that always brings up for me is if you're hesitating to use the word autism in that context, is your son feeling that in his life? Is he ashamed to talk about autism? Is he not feel good about the word? How often is that word used in, in a hushed tone and that kind of stuff? Because that's where the negative stigma came from. So what I say to parents is, yes, tell them. Why not? If it was obvious that your child had blue eyes, that you would see that they had blue eyes, you would not have to point it out. But because you can't see autism, you have to point it out. And it's such an integral part in who we are as people. I mean, I can't take my brain out and take a 5-minute break from my autism. I live with it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. When I'm dreaming, I'm autistic. When I'm awake, I'm autistic. There is no break. And so it's not like I want to walk around and I get to pretend to not be autistic for a little bit. And I certainly wouldn't want the next generation of autistics to feel that they should have to even do that. So I think the earlier we can teach them that autism is just a word, it's who you are, it's just like being gay or being smart or having blue eyes, the more we do that and create it to be a normal, that's what adds to inclusion. Then we'll get the inclusion is when we create a normalcy around that word.
As an ally, I'll just add, I had an experience. We work with autistic students at NYU in an NYU Connections program to support autistic students and help them be successful. And a student that wasn't in our program that had graduated was having difficulty. I think he'd been on 300, sent out 300 resumes for a job. And he came to me, the Career Center directed him to me and sent me a beautiful chart of his strengths and abilities and talents. And disclosure is tricky, but he came to me and I said, how can I help you? And he said, can you help me be not so stiff? And I said, no, you're always gonna appear stiff. That's who you are. And and I said, but have you thought about talking about the strengths you bring to the situation and you're autistic and you bring these strengths and this is why you'll do the job better. And he was shocked. because of this stigma. He was shocked. He's like, oh, I could do that? And it does bring risks, so you have to be very careful. But at the same time, you know, a model that sets up, let me try to make you look more like me and then you'll be successful, isn't gonna work.
Nope.
Isn't gonna work.
And it's part of the reason we have a mental health problem.
Exactly,
So the
exactly.
reason that the anxiety comes from, the depression comes from, and it's not, we're not born with it necessarily, the anxiety and depression. Those things kind of build up into their level of intensity over years of living with that stigma. And that stigma doesn't come internally, it comes from out there. So the more of us that are placating into that stigma, the more of it continues to live. And so I say, no, shout it, you know, scare the world with it. Who cares, you know? I think it's just such a natural variation to who we are as human beings that there's a part of my brain I just want to say, I don't get it. But I do get intellectually, I get it, but I just want to be like, I don't get it. Because I really don't get what the big deal is anymore. And it was such a huge positive in my life that I super don't get it. So it's, you know, it's on top of it, yeah.
So ideally, there should not be this separate sit-down disclosure type thing, but it should be more just a topic of conversation. Just like you talk about somebody having brown eyes or blonde hair. It's just a characteristic. It's an expression of the diversity of the human gene pool.
Okay.
Hi. Oh, sorry, I'm loud normally. Okay. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you for coming out here and letting us all hear your perspectives. I feel like I feel very humbled thinking that I was this autistic ally all my life, and I feel like I just got slapped with a whole different reality and perspective, and I think I just feel really grateful for having that opportunity.
I'm going to say 2 words, mission accomplished.
Yeah. Like have a puzzle piece tattoo, that type of level of slapped into reality. So thank you. I think my question is, as an OT, or a future OT, I'm a student, I'm really interested in community, and you all really reflected on the importance of having an autistic community. And do you feel like that there is a role for OTs in helping to support autistic individuals to create this community, or do you think this is something that maybe we need to step back and let autistic individuals develop their own communities?
Providing the support or structure in which to enable that community by promoting getting rid of the negative stigma and focusing on strengths and helping to make connections to other autistic individuals. That would be a great help.
Yeah. I think, too, like, just having this aha moment that you're having and taking it with you in your daily life. Not even as an OT, just as you, right? And sharing that message and taking the learned lesson and continuing to educate and pass it on, correcting misinformation when you hear it, that kind of stuff, making sure that people are using the correct terms and they understand why they're using them. I think that's what, as an autistic, I would love for parents to be given that language. So if you end up working with kids, making sure that the parents are reiterating what you're using and teaching at home, so that it gets replicated. If I could replicate a model and send it out into the world like a computer virus, I would love to do that, but I can't. So I have you. So go be a computer virus.
On it. Thanks.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Cassandra, and I'm an occupational therapy student right now in a master's program. And we have a classmate who, he may be on the spectrum, he may not. That's not for me to judge. But he has some quirky behaviors, and we are a very younger class, and he's an older gentleman. And I'm just wondering, what's some advice that I could bring back to my classmates? Because sometimes they don't react in the best ways.
Lead by example. Really, genuinely. People are so stubborn and they're so stuck in their habits. I mean, I thank you all for remembering to do the flaps, but at the UN, it took like 5 rounds of applause for people to remember to flap and not clap. So, I mean, if you can lead by example, model the behavior. If you see incorrect behavior, say, oh, maybe that wasn't so nice. Next time, could you do this? You know what I mean? People don't learn unless it's in real time. And that's the trick, actually, about what happened to autism, right? We weren't learning in real time. You can give us skills assessment tests. We're all passing them, okay? There's an answer. We have it. No problem. But that's not how life works. That's not how you learn. You learn in real time and with repeated practice. So do it. Lead it. It's really that easy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Over this side.
Hi, I am Brooke. I have a cousin that is 3 years old. She was recently diagnosed autistic. She is nonverbal, and her parents are having a really hard time coping with it because she's had a lot of medical issues, and she's been in the hospital in and out her whole entire life. and I see it kind of affecting their marriage. So I was wondering what advice for parents you have that are new parents dealing with this.
Find other people who have dealt with it.
Me too.
The parents have, there are support groups of other parents who work with this. You'll want to get connected to people who have a positive outlook and consider what we've been talking about, the strengths or abilities. And sure, you do have to be realistic about the challenges. There's plenty of them, medical and otherwise. And that's where I'd start. I'd start by seeking other parents who are having the same or similar experiences. They're out there.
Thank you.
And I know Paul is typing a response as well. So, and I think I would echo positive outlook. You know, I think there are different types of parent support groups that really finding people that really aren't looking at it as a tragedy and as an awful incident, because that sets up a whole different path.
It's sort of like they have a choice now about the information that they're kind of loading in, and so being careful about where you're picking that information from. So choosing the people that are using words that say strength-based approach, that talk about the challenges, not the deficits, that, you know, look for that language in the groups that they're looking to form, because that gives it away as to what the group itself is meaning to do. So I think community is the number one. I mean, if I didn't find my community immediately after my diagnosis, I think I would have gotten stuck in it. But because I found my community, and because when I stood for the first time as an openly autistic person in a room of other openly autistic people, it wasn't like a giant freak show of screaming people, because, you know, I had my own, right? I had my own image of what that was in my head. I grew up in a time when the R word was used freely. And so it's sort of, you know, I had that fear. But then as soon as I surrounded myself with what the reality of the community is, it all changed. And so that's really what it is.
And if we could pull up Paul's response on his iPad.
Get a lot of SI for the baby.
A lot of SI for the baby. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I think I've been told that we have a hard stop at 10:15. So let's try to get in a couple more questions, because these questions are wonderful.
Okay. My name's Noreen. I'm an OT. I'm a school-based OT, so I work with a lot of kiddos with autism. Sorry, that light's brutal. That's why. We recently had a student who discovered she had autism by a comment from a peer, because she did something. I can't remember exactly the details, but she did something, and her peers were like, "Oh, she did that because she's autistic," and that's how this girl discovered that she has autism. I guess kind of building on the question about building community, I guess one thing is, where do I find you guys? Where do I find adults with autism to come and talk to my parents and talk to my students about being adults with autism? I know there's the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. I mean, is that something that they do? Do you have ideas about how I can help my parents? Because it's one thing for me to go and say these things to them, but I think it's something entirely different to have someone with autism talk to them. I think it's really powerful, and I thank you for coming and sharing with us too.
Well, you talk to one of us, or I don't know where you live, but I would...
Chicago.
Chicago. So I think it would start with a Google search. Autistic people, Chicago. That should lead you to those of us who are on the autism spectrum, support groups, organizations related to autism. And again, as Becca said, look at the language. Are they talking about supports, or are they talking about epidemics and disasters? And you want to go to the support side of things, the strength side of things, and asking people in those organizations, where can I find an autistic adult? Because I know where we are, we're in New York, so we'd know where to get dozens of autistic adults. And I'm sure there's the same analogy in Chicago.
I will say that Facebook is a really good place to look for groups in general, because I think autism itself right now is still very isolating. As autistic individuals, I personally, I'm an introvert on top of being autistic, so I really don't leave the house. And so I think when you look in the internet, you'll find that especially two parents will find great resources on Facebook, because you don't have the time to like go anywhere when stuff is happening in your life. So people go there when the emergencies happen. So it's a great place to just kind of find an organization. If you find their Facebook page, you'll see the language of the participants and the other members, and it's like a super key into whether you're looking at a good one or not.
I just want to add one thing, because I get a lot of people calling me saying, oh, you work a lot with autistic self-advocates. Do you know of anyone? And I say, what's your budget?
Yeah.
You know, and I think we've got to really honor that compensation. This is a huge issue and a huge problem. If you want autistic individuals to come and talk to your parents, you would pay me as an expert at NYU to come. You know, we would talk about what I charge, et cetera. Honor that same commitment to compensation.
Thank you.
All right, so my question might be, I don't know if you have time.
And this is the last
Okay.
one. Okay.
So my name's Gretchen, and I work in a behavioral health network. So we have a lot of clients that aren't able to participate in their home communities, and I feel like a lot of them are disempowered. And we've had some specific examples of that. But there's a huge push for ABA, and ABA has a lot of scientific backing, and it's noted in some circles as the only evidence-based practice for treating people with autism. And I feel that's kind of a misnomer. And I want to know what your perspective of that is. I've heard from some other individuals with autism and their perspectives. And so I'd really love to know how you feel about ABA, or if you've had ABA services, and what your perception is. And I can see Paul's typing out a response.
Yeah, I know he's going to have
Yeah, well, what my parents did with me, there even wasn't ABA. The closest was some sort of behavioral modification thing. But what they did is more characterized by a developmental approach. And that's not to trash ABA, but it's to say my parents provided me what I needed. ABA does have a place. It is one of many tools. And really what it's a matter of is matching practice, matching reasoned practice to individual needs. And it's determining what does that child need and what would they benefit from. Might it be an approach that's a little bit more like floor time, or another developmental approach such as Miller method? Is there something that ABA can contribute? And also what's important is to get an understanding of the whole child. Sometimes what I see happening is ABA practitioners getting over-involved in modifying behaviors and losing the humanity of the child in the process. One gift the ABA practitioners gave to us is the idea of a functional behavior assessment, and within that assessment also includes inner states of the child, looking beyond just the behavior. What about the sensory aspects of the environment? What about emotional aspects? What about just maybe being hungry and it's time to eat? So we got to look at all of these aspects in order to determine why a certain behavior is occurring or not occurring.
I'm going to ask Becca if you have a quick answer, then we'll put up Paul's.
Let Paul go.
Okay. Paul is typing now an answer, so if.
I'll just say my quick thing about ABA is I don't think it's about the therapy. I think it's about the therapist. I also think there was a time, and ABA has its place, right? But there's a time when we thought that, the sun revolved around us, and then we found out that no, it wasn't the case, and then we said, okay, we put that science aside. So I think that we're in a place now where we're learning, and I think we're finding that therapies like CBT and DBT are a little bit more successful for people in a sustainable way on the spectrum, and I think we're gearing that way. So I just think we're at a movement place, and we're going to be shifting soon, yeah.
Thank you.
And we'll let Paul finish his thought as the clock ticks down to our hard stop.
So I just want to, while Paul's finishing his response, I'll say a few more things. So I had a client, and he would continually say, am I different?
Okay, but it can't be a question because we have no more time for questions. So if you have just like one lasting thought.
Yeah, but just thank you for showing the community aspect of it. And they incorporated that ABA, and so it kind of became more of a damaging thing, and I'm seeing it more and more with adolescents rather than young children. And I don't know if you see that would have an impact.
That's a question.
It's the same question. It's still easy.
Well, everybody's different. Everybody's got their unique characteristics and profiles. Anybody who would ask me if they're different, I would probably say yes, and so am I. And it's good to be different. We don't want everybody to be the same. Otherwise, it would be very boring and not much would get done in the world. We all specialize in various things. Looks like Paul's getting to be about ready. Okay.
Well, because we said ABA.
You said ABA, and we now have a thesis dissertation. So
Anybody need a dissertation topic?
It definitely was a no. We want to honor all means of communication. So, Frank, can we do one more question while Paul finishes typing? Real quick question.
Hi, I'm Kristie. I'm an occupational therapist. I started doing discrete trials as a teacher assistant, and that's when I decided I need to be an OT. I used to sit in the little booths doing these trials with these children, and the children, I would see the anxiety just peak up. And I was like, okay, can we do something on a different side of the room where he's not in this small closed room doing these trials. He was just very upset. And so we did it in a beanbag instead in the corner. And then I said, what?
No, go ahead.
Oh, so sorry. So I could totally understand why the ABA is a little bit harsh in some aspects. However, it's proven to show some changes in behavior, but that's acceptable behavior for others, not for the children. When I work with children now in EI, I have a great story to tell you. One of my students is starting to talk and say his ABCs, but that's because we do sensory integration, and I let the child take me on the journey with him. I don't necessarily take him on the educational journey with me, because the idea is that he has a different way of learning and communicating with me, which I take the time to listen, and I take the time to observe, because, we all have this understanding how to act, how to be, but in his world, it's a different way. And I really appreciate it. And now I had the parents peeking in the room like, oh my goodness. And I tell them, I say, this is a learning experience for all of us. And you guys should be in the room with us, enjoying this. And they said, no, we distract him. I said, no, he's excited that you're here. He knows you're here with us. And, he may run away from me to go to you because, this is his little break.
Thank you. I don't want to cut it off, but Paul, you want to give us your final thought? Okay. I think this is very good to end on, actually.
I agree with Stephen that it has its place. Control can be damaging. For someone who is very dyspraxic, they can't do all that is asked. I could have written a description of a block structure but couldn't move the blocks. Disheartening.
And I think, Paul, if I can share, when I first met you and we started talking, and you talked about the blocks and all the trials with the blocks, and I think you said, I knew they wanted me to put the damn blue block on top of the yellow block. I just couldn't think and move at the same time. And you have moved us today. You've all moved us today, and I just want to thank the panel for sharing.